Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be discussing one of my favorite film series of all time, starring one of my favorite superheroes of all time, which is the original Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, which I actually went back and rewatched in its entirety this week. And instead of doing a marathon review, because I didn't watch them all sequentially like I often do, what I decided to do was I'm going to be reviewing each of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy individually. And of course, I'm going to begin with where it all started, with the original Spider-Man movie starring Tobey Maguire. And with regard to this movie, going into it when I was a kid, I honestly had pretty high expectations. I was already a big Spider-Man fan at that point in time, with him being one of my favorite superheroes, and I had seen all the cartoons up until that point, including the 60s one, and the one where everyone's pointing at each other and has all the memes on the internet in the subsequent years. And also, of course, the radioactive Spider-Man, which was my favorite of the bunch. And I had read some of the comics, so by the time I saw the movie, I was hoping it was going to be good. And quite frankly, I loved it going in. Aside from a few things here and there by the time I left the theater, which I'll be discussing here because there are still a couple things along the way that I don't quite think worked as well in the initial movie. But I'm going to be getting into that. Before I do though, however, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications. That way you can stay up to date with all of my future videos coming here on Laughingstock Cinema. How's it going? Additionally, make sure to leave a like on this video, share this video out, and continue to stay for the entire duration. That way you'll help this channel to go even further beyond to Excelsior levels, to quote the late great Stan Lee. But with all that being said, let's get into the review. Okay, so getting into Spider-Man, let's first talk about the cast. Of course, beginning with Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man. And for me, of course, like I just said before, I had a lot of expectations going into this movie with regard to Spider-Man himself. However, I think that overall, Tobey did an amazing job as Spider-Man in this movie, and I'll get into some of the other casts too. Now, the thing is that a lot of people might either not like Tobey Maguire or like a lot of his take on the story, in large part because the fact that, well, when you look at the movie, especially by today's standard and lens, it's quite a bit different in terms of one key thing, which is tone. Nowadays, most comic book movies that come out, they are very serious. They're taking themselves way too serious, in fact, a lot of the time, where everything has to be grounded, it has to be down to earth, everyone has to act like normal people that they do in our real world. But when you actually look at the original Spider-Man trilogy by Sam Raimi, it's very clear that Raimi, Tobey Maguire, and the people on the movies really embraced the source material, because the fact that comics are supposed to be kind of goofy, kind of wacky, kind of campy, especially Spider-Man and other characters like Batman, stuff like that, who were introduced during periods of time when we were seeing a lot of camp in there. These are characters at the end of the day dressed up in colorful outfits, and they are punching each other, they're, fighting for cities, they're doing a lot of things which you could argue are really over the top and kind of ridiculous depending upon how you're looking at it. So the fact that these movies decide to fully embrace that, including with kind of ridiculous dialogue along the way, some of which I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of, and I feel like the dialogue is one of the weak points of this movie at times, because it could be a little bit too on the nose and in your face. Like, for example, when they first introduce Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and their first opening scene is basically explaining how their characters are in like one scene in like a kind of obvious fashion. And of course, some of the one-liners that Spider-Man says to Goblin, like calling him Gobby and stuff like that. But nonetheless, I really love how this film was not afraid of the source material and just decided to go all in with it. Of course, not everything is necessarily one-to-one with the original story, and I'll definitely get into that with some of the other characters. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that I think that this ended up just working out great. And one of the biggest things that I think about, especially nowadays, and I notice the huge similarities between, is this and also the Christopher Reeve Donner's Superman movies, where these movies are also very true to the source material in terms of tone, in terms of being a little bit campy. I mean, for example, we have a scene where Superman literally turns himself in a track so that train can go over him. They were not afraid to embrace the more earnest nature of Superman, of the characters, making him the quote-unquote Boy Scout, and having everything work in that way. And the Spider-Man movies by Sam Raimi really embrace the same thing. I mean, there are a lot of similarities between Spider-Man and Superman, after all. Like, for example, the fact that they both kind of are young people who have superpowers that have to deal with real life and also their powers at the same time, who both are reporters that work for, like, the Daily Bugle or the Daily Planet. There's a lot of those similarities between the two characters, which must have had a lot of inspiration for the creators of Spider-Man when they originally put everything into print on the comics. And I think that this was a great way to go. It's kind of like what we see more recently with the original Captain America, the first Avenger movie, where again, it embraced the source material, although it did deviate a little bit more, just like some of these did in certain degrees. And I think that Tobey is an excellent kind of embodiment of that tone, and so too are so many of the extras that Sam Raimi has in the movies along the way, so many of the different characters that he introduces. And in terms of the other performances as well, of course, we have the great performances brought by the actors for Uncle Ben and Aunt May, Cliff Robertson and Rosemary Harris, who did a great job. We also have James Franco playing Harry Osborn, the younger Harry Osborn at this point, before he eventually becomes the Hobgoblin in the comics and cartoons. And then, we see what happens later on in the movies as well. And we also have, of course, Willem Dafoe, who does an amazing job as not only Norman Osborn, but also the Green Goblin.
I'm something of a scientist myself.
And he does an amazing job of switching seamlessly between the two characters in scenes, which are basically like straight out of Lord of the Rings with Gollum and Smeagol talking to one another. And Willem Dafoe did the exact same thing in terms of switching between scenes. I mean, there's so much of this trilogy too, which is kind of funny when you think about the inspirations that Sam Raimi took. They're straight out of Shakespeare, straight out of Hamlet, especially come the second movie and beyond, where essentially we have eventually Norman Osborn serving as the Spectre that leads the character of Harry instead of Hamlet to try and take revenge. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that he does a great job as the villain. And the only thing I'll say in terms of the weakness for me, and it always was this even when I was a kid, and I think a lot of people might agree, especially nowadays, is the look of the Green Goblin suit. Because the fact of the matter is that they had a way better looking suit that they were testing before they actually made it to screen. And unfortunately, the one that we end up getting ends up looking like, a Power Rangers villain or something like that. It doesn't look anywhere near as good as the awesome Tobey Maguire textured textile suit that we see on screen or some of the other live action portrayals. And so I always have been a little bit disappointed in the look of the original Green Goblin suit, but nonetheless, Willem Dafoe does such a great job in the role as the villain that it leads to it, not being that big of a deal, even though, like I said, the Spider-Man suit is significantly better looking when it comes to being on screen. I also really like how in this movie he actually designs the suit and we see everything play out that way. And not just that, but also that they did a really interesting kind of change from the comics where Spider-Man shoots out webs from his body instead of from his web shooters that he creates. I like the web shooters and the concept, and also gives him more of a limitation if he runs out of the web fluid. But nonetheless, I think that it also kind of plays into the ideas and the themes of puberty that Peter's going through, that he suddenly starts shooting out white strings everywhere. Especially that scene where Aunt May tries to go to his room and it's covered in the webs, and he's like, oh, you don't come in. It's like, I wonder what Sam Raimi was going for there. Funny enough though, based upon like interviews and stuff like that, from what I saw, Sam Raimi and Tobey Maguire actually didn't really get along that well when they were making the movies, which led to him wanting to recast Tobey in the second movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. But I'll get into that when it finally comes. But nonetheless, for me, I think that Tobey does an awesome job in the role, playing that earnest, nerdy, and a little bit campy, it's somewhat over the top type of Spider-Man. In the exact same way that we also see Christopher Reeve putting in an amazing performance for not only the Clark Kent, but Superman aspects of his Superman portrayal, where he did that amazing, iconic job. And we also can't forget about the amazing performance in these movies by J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, who he's so great in the role that they literally couldn't even recast him in the future movies. They still had to keep bringing this guy back, even in other adaptations of Spider-Man. And every time he's on screen, it's awesome and it's hilarious. And that's one of the things with these movies. They are way funnier than probably any of the other Spider-Man movies. Despite being earnest, despite still having emotional beats, they have really funny moments. In some of the future movies, they go a little bit too far with the humor, especially in the third one, which I'll get into when I review it. But nonetheless, the fact of the matter is that the humor, the direction, everything is on point in these movies. But with that being said, I feel like the first one is a lot more subdued in many of those ways compared to what is to come in the future, particularly with regard to Sam Raimi and his kind of over-the-top direction. He definitely gets to express more of his, let's say, horror movie inspirations after this film with the sequels. After all, he was the one who directed the Evil Dead movies, and he always is putting out some really fun movies for the most part, with even, the most recent Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness is a movie I end up really enjoying, in large part because of the direction of Sam Raimi and everything that he had on display there, which he's a little more restrained in this movie, but definitely gets to do a lot more of what he made a name for in the subsequent films, especially when he's dialing up the horror aspects, although they certainly do have some here and there in this movie, particularly with scenes with the Green Goblin. Now, with that being said, I do want to talk about the character of Mary Jane in this movie, because she tends to be a negative for a lot of people when it comes to the overall trilogy. MJ's for the streets. When it comes to MJ and her performance and portrayal by Kirsten Dunst, she works well with the version of the character that they're telling in the movies. The version of MJ in the movies is a lot different from what we end up seeing in the comics and the cartoons. And a lot of that, she comes from a broken home with an abusive family. So basically it comes down to a lot of it where she is kind of seeking validation at a constant basis throughout the course of the Tobey trilogy, and it ends up causing issues for the two of them, especially when she, has a thing already for Peter and, he's in love with her. And then we start to see, Harry, for example, at points in the movie kind of like getting, revenge on him because the fact that Harry is, not as beloved by his father as he wants to be, which is his whole motivation really to earn his father's love and respect. And then he starts to date MJ, who Peter is getting the affection from his father. And so, there's a lot of that kind of love triangle aspect that goes throughout these movies, especially considering the fact that MJ doesn't know that Peter is Spider-Man for the first, movie and a half. If you'd want to say that long, you can argue at the end of this movie, she starts to figure it out and piece it together. She pulls the whole Princess Leia thing I knew the entire time in the second movie. But nonetheless, in this one, I feel like the relationship dramas and stuff are something I'm not a fan of at all in this movie or this entire trilogy. And, the fact that MJ is constantly trying to do things to kind of get revenge on Peter at different points and try and, get back at him and things. I don't like that portrayal as much as like the awesome, supportive, loving MJ that we get to see in the comics and the cartoons, who, kind of just hits it off with Peter right away. But I understand that they're trying to show Peter as like a outcast, a nerdy, kind of down his luck kid who has a really heart of gold, despite, being seen as a loser by people and bullied and stuff, and gets this power, and he has to use the iconic line of, with great power comes great responsibility, and then in turn, try and win over the girl who's like the pretty girl that he's always been in love with since he met her and stuff. But at the same time, I do prefer the other portrayal of MJ way more than this. And I do not mean the one from the Tom Holland movies, because that one is much worse than this one as far as I'm concerned. And other than that, I think the biggest problem I always had with the movie is the ending. Not only do we get the death of the Green Goblin, which for me is something that, I kind of wish that he had survived, because one of the things is that I always like in the comics and cartoons when we have recurring characters, and then when the villains are like, teaming up with other villains or having new plans and things like that. But one of the big things that we saw throughout so many superhero movies, even until recently, but especially back then, is that they would always kill the villain off, and that always kind of disappointed me. Not just that, but also the other ending involving Mary Jane and the fact that she and Spider-Man do not end up together like they do in the comics and the cartoons. Instead, they decide to once again stretch out the whole like romance drama situation, and then at that point, it led to it simply not working out quite, the way it should have, where it's like, oh, I'm sorry, but I can only be with you as a friend. Because Peter was afraid that if a villain found out about MJ and that he was in love with her and that they were together and stuff, it would lead to them attacking her, despite the fact that she still gets attacked in every single movie and held hostage or something, even though he's not going out with her, and, it just keeps happening. I just never liked that. I thought it was forced and something that even when I was a kid, I was like, are you kidding me? And, was not something I enjoyed. Now, another thing too is some of the CGI does not really hold up, especially with this movie. The CGI gets better as the movies go on, but you could definitely tell this was CGI from 20-ish years ago, so it wasn't really going to stand the test of time. The practical effects, for the most part, are great, and when it comes to those, Sam Raimi does a great job with those in all of his films, dating back to The Evil Dead, Army of Darkness, everything like that. But the fact of the matter is, in this movie, too much CGI, too much rubbery Spider-Man, rubbery Peter when he's doing his moves and stuff like that. Another thing I also really like about this movie and the superhero movies from the time is that they used to have really in-depth intros, almost kind of like a Bond movie or, a film of an earlier era. We had that for Spider-Man. We had that for the X-Men movies. And so many films around that time did them. And I've always kind of been disappointed with the loss of intros when it comes to many films over the years. They really can set the mood and set the tone for the film that's coming out, but so too often everyone wants to get immediately into the meat or the substance of the film. And it really goes to show you the difference in pacing between modern movies compared to back then, because there are so many scenes in these original Spider-Man movies that would have been sped up several times comparatively, because they would probably be afraid that people are getting too bored because they spend 2 extra seconds watching somebody standing somewhere before he punches somebody or does something else. However, this review can't be complete, and neither can the pros and cons, without me talking about the amazing score by Danny Elfman, which, really shows you just how great the scores were for superhero movies back in the day compared to a lot of them that come out today, which are really bland and just, don't really have anything stand out. The themes by Danny Elfman in this movie are great. Danny Elfman also did the Batman movie with Tim Burton, of course, which led to the creation of the Batman the Animated Series intro. And, he's done a lot of great work over the years on these films, especially the films of Tim Burton too. And so he did a great job and, really made the movie get risen to another level with that awesome score. I don't necessarily like the score that he does in every movie, or at least some of the tracks, which I'll definitely get more into in my future reviews. But nonetheless, I think he did an amazing job and deserves a lot of credit for his overall work on this film. Now, in terms of this movie, it does currently have a 7.4 score on IMDb. In terms of that rating, I'm not sure that I would necessarily say it would be a 7.4, at least a 7.5, which I know is kind of splitting hairs there. Maybe up to an 8, although like I said, it isn't quite as great for me as the subsequent film, but it was a great start, an iconic beginning, and something overall I think did an excellent job of setting Spider-Man into live action, much like the original X-Men movies did, even if they didn't live up to the same quality of like the cartoons and stuff, and films of this time, also like Blade. But all right, guys, this has been my review of the original Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire and directed by Sam Raimi. Overall, I still think it's a really good movie, something that I definitely recommend for fans of Spider-Man, comic book movies, and just fun action movies from this time. Just keep in mind it was made in the early 2000s, has some of those early 2000 isms, and it has a number of other things going for it that you might kind of be like, oh, the effects effects don't look quite as good or this or that. However, I do honestly feel like early 2000s comic book movies have a certain charm that most of the movies today simply do not have, either because of their stronger direction, their less reliance on cinematic universes, their more quirky and campy nature. Whatever it is, I plan to do a video about that more in depth in the future. But with that being said, guys, if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing and enabling all notifications. Thanks for watching, and make sure to stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.